Well, we got a small group tonight, but it's about time to get started. Past time, actually. We have a lot of people out sick, so there's something going around. Thankfully, it's not anything major that I know of. I know that one person has COVID, but he said he didn't really have many symptoms, just didn't want to give it to anybody else, just in case. So we're going to be looking at difficult issues still again, and tonight's is profanity. This is one that, I was taught to not use foul language, but I don't think I've ever heard a lesson on it. I've heard a lesson at camp, I take that back, and he was talking about euphemisms, but haven't really had much about profanity, and so I thought, maybe we need to cover this. So this is going to be just difficult issues. It's taken from headlines, from newspaper articles talking about the subject, and then kind of shows you how important it is and kind of things that are going on in our society, and so we can have some discussion about it, because the Bible applies to everyday living. It's not just theoretical. So we'll talk about that, and then we're going to get into a lot of different things over the next several weeks. So let's go ahead and have a prayer, and we get started. Father, thank you so much for all that you've done for us, for your love, the mercy you show us. Help us, Father, as we go through class tonight, that we can learn more about you and our responsibilities toward you, the things that you require of us. Lord, please help us to see those things put into practice in our own lives. Lord, as we go through, we also pray that you'll help us to be mindful of others, that we can be a light to the community, a light to the people around us, that we can be pure and holy, that we can bring honor and glory to you in the way we behave ourselves. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Okay, so this one is from an article that actually says, here are the Texas cities that swear the most and the least. And it's a kind of it's not funny, but it's funny. But there are 3 Texas cities that made the list of the top cities that swear the most in the country. And 2 of those 3 cities are in the Metroplex. Preply, it's a language learning company, surveyed more than 1,500 residents of 30 major U.S. cities. So I don't know how much, if this is a scientific poll or what, but they asked how often they swear, which situations make them swear a lot, and at what age they started swearing. Here's what they found. The average respondent swears 21 times a day. That seems like a lot. The U.S. city that swears the most frequently does anyone want to guess? You probably would never guess. Columbus, Ohio, 36 times a day. Those northerners. When I was growing up, that's what everyone said. If people were cussing, is that those northerners coming down here. That's what they're doing. I don't know if that's true, but the U.S. city that swears the most frequently is Columbus. The average age Americans start using swear words is, anybody want to guess? If you see it, you're reading it. 11. That's when they admit it, at least. And over half of Americans use swear word substitutions. So another word for that is euphemism. Younger generations are more likely to curse. Gen Z swears an average of 24 times a day, compared to boomers that swear about 10 times a day. As for who uses more profanity, men or women, it's men. Men, on average, curse 22 times a day, and women curse 18 times daily. It says something that people would actually be able to, I guess they're just give them lumps, and they say, do you swear 1 to 4 times or, 5 to 12 times? I don't know how they did this, because I couldn't count it if I was doing it. But because how many of y'all can tell me how many times you said the word that today? If it's just part of your vernacular, I don't know. So it may be worse than it actually sounds. So Texas cities that swear the most, there's actually some that did the least, but it's not in the article. I didn't have room to put it in there. Dallas is tied for 4th with Oklahoma City and Philadelphia and Indianapolis. 25 times a day. Fort Worth tied for 5th, along with San Francisco and Louisville, with 24 a day. And Austin came in at number 7, tying Los Angeles, 21 times a day. So it's just something that we all know is prevalent, right? It's a problem in society, and we'll talk about why that's such a big deal. But we have to recognize that there are reasons, that there are things we shouldn't say, and we call it profanity. And we generally, I don't know about you, but whenever I had children, my attitude toward words changed dramatically. I didn't usually use profanity, but when I had children, other words started becoming more. The word stupid, for example. I used to say it all the time, but then I heard my 3-year-old say it, and I was like, that sounds different. It feels different. So I'm not saying that that's a bad word, but we kind of change our scruples as we get older. So here are the questions. There's 9 basic questions. We're going to look through several passages. But why couldn't the Bible supply a list of forbidden words? Yeah, they change, and every language is different, and we get new ones all the time, right? So that's the nature of language. Could you imagine how big the Bible would be if they just had a list of the words we can't use? And we'd have to look at our language to find them. If there's not a list of forbidden words, does it mean that we can't know which words to avoid? Yeah. Yes. They acknowledge it. Yeah. And I had an interesting conversation with a couple of preachers one time that they believed it was okay to just say whatever they wanted to. And so I was asking them about it. And at first they denied it, but in a roundabout way they admitted it. And their thinking was, it's just a word. We assign meaning to the words. And so I can make it mean whatever I want to. I can say the word and it doesn't mean anything to me. I said, well, it means something to me. He said, yeah, that's why I don't use the word around you. I only use it around people that I know that understand. They have enlightenment. They know that these words don't mean anything, and we assign whatever meaning we want to, so it doesn't matter what we say. So, that's a dangerous place to be, because if that's the case, then we can't ever say profanity. And we know that the Bible teaches against that. So here's the thing about it. But we have to admit something there. Does the arrangement of letters have power within themselves to create? So if we happen to arrange these letters in a certain way, then that in itself has power to be a curse. Obviously not, right? So it's not the word itself, but what's bad about the word? The meaning. So there is some assignment of meaning. I mean, we have to admit that. And we go to, when I was studying Russian, my teacher, he said, Jason, you need to be very careful, because he knew I hadn't learned any other languages before. He said, you'll be surprised how easy it is to cuss in another language. I said, really? Why? He said, because here you've grown up knowing you shouldn't say those words, and there you're learning new words, and it doesn't feel bad at all to say them. He said, you got to be really careful. But if I was walking around in a Russian city and I'm saying words and I'm cussing my head off, does that mean that it doesn't matter because I don't really understand? Yeah, exactly. The words have meaning to those people, and so we have to be careful, have to be compliant, I guess is the right word, or respectful of other people. So the words themselves do not contain within it magic or power or anything like that. There are people that believe, like in potions and magicians, witchcraft. They believe that certain words actually have power within themselves. So if you even accidentally say a certain word, then you're calling all kinds of, you may call power upon you because it's a word and it has meaning. But I think that's a really bad way of looking at language. Yes. Yes, it's the, yeah. Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of power in that. Yeah, exactly. They're words that when they have meaning applied to them, that's where the power is. It's what meaning of the word. So that's one of the things I love to do is do word studies, because when you really understand a word, you understand it better. You can get more out of it. So here's a question I think we can probably all relate to. Can a word change over time from being bad to good, or from good to bad? The word bad. Yeah. It means bad again. Yeah, because bad meant good. Yeah. In the 80s, I remember that. Uh huh. Yes. It changes. Carla has told me about books she's read from the 1800s, and she has to be really careful if she reads them to other people, because they have words in there that mean something different now. And words can also turn good, right? So who decides if they're good or bad? This vague people called society, right? Our culture. Yeah, that's probably right. And that generally tends to be the case, that women tend to be more refined in the way they use language. And that even shows in the article that was written where they swear less, right? So that can be a challenge, and there's certain words that you might even see that they're changing. So how do you know when you can use the word or not? So if it's changing from bad to good, and for a lot of people it means something good, but we've grown up meaning it bad, can you still use it? And how do you know when you can? That's one of those challenging questions that it doesn't happen that often, but we still have to be really careful. And we have to use our scruples, right? We have to think about what we're saying and whether or not it bothers us, first of all, and also whether or not, like you said, you can't use that word anymore. We have to start being respectful and recognize that maybe we need to be careful with this word and start using a different one, and that can be challenging. And like was mentioned, sometimes we don't know, so we say things, and there's a running joke with my daughter about her mother-in-law, a particular word she uses, and it means something that she doesn't think it means, but she won't stop saying it, and so it's kind of funny. It's not really terrible, but it's kind of pushing the line. So we have to be sensitive to that kind of stuff. All right, let's look at some passages. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 4. There's a couple of these actually in here. I wanted to try to just talk through what these mean. In verse 4 it says, "Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks." All right, this is stuff that we can't. He says in verse 3, "Let it not even be named among you, as is fitting for saints." So what is, filthiness is not just words, but isn't that a type of language? Filthy language? Well, how would you define that? Vulgar, yeah. And sometimes that could be, it's just talking about worldly things, and we know what that means. There's no reason to give examples of it, but it's when we're talking about filthiness, it usually has to do with impurity. And so we're using words and language that is impure, and that would include, what kind of words, generally speaking, would that include? Any idea? The most obvious one would be sexual content of some kind. Another one would be jokes. Can that fit into the dirty category? Certainly. And those things we have to be careful with. And then he also has the next one in there. What does he say in verse 4? Foolish talking. What is foolish talking? Does your translation say something different than foolish talking? Foolish talk. It's obviously related to speech. Have you ever thought about the fact that foolish talking is not really something we should be doing? I mean, does that mean that we can't ever joke around and have fun? Yeah, I don't think that's right. I'm going to be in trouble because I like to joke around. But that happens sometimes. So to me, foolish talking means you're just dealing with foolishness. You're talking about things that don't matter. It's kind of you're consumed with ridiculous things and ridiculous arguments and ridiculous thoughts, and that really don't amount to anything. It doesn't mean that we can't ever have fun, but it means that what's our focus? I think that relates to that. Are we being a foolish person, or we actually have some kind of merit of having some wisdom in our lives? If you contrast foolishness and wisdom, I think it helps with the understanding of it. And then he says coarse jesting. What is coarse jesting about? Did yours say coarse also? What's coarse language? Gutter talk. Yeah, that kind of fits in with the crude and the filthiness. Before, I'm not checking text messages. I'm looking at my phone to see what the word translates. Let's see here, because I looked it up and I forgot what it says. Anyone else have a thought? Yeah. Ribaldry. I don't know what that means. I think of ribbing someone. Maybe that's where it came from. That's exactly what I was thinking. When I think of coarse, I think of hurtful. Yeah, that, the kind of the cutting insults. Irreverent. That would fit there too, I think. And that was something that for a long time I had a really, really hard time with, because I grew up with sarcasm. That was just, and it was cutting. It was always that way. And I've had to learn not to be that way, but sometimes it still comes out. So that's part of what he's saying here, this coarse jesting of hurting people, making fun of them, that kind of thing. And that's, we don't always think about vulgarity and profanity. We think of certain words, but we can hurt people with our words, and that's also bad. It's also evil to do that. So I think that fits into that. If we ask that question related to this survey, I think the numbers are going to go up, right? So none of us are, James chapter 3 tells us that no one can tame the tongue. Right? We all stumble in many points, and there's lots of ways that we can use this to help us identify places where we might be weaker. Oh, wow. That's nice. Yeah. And so a good rule of thumb is if you don't know if you should say it or not, then don't say it. And that's sometimes really hard to do, because if it's funny or if it's something that you feel like you've just got to say it, it can be really hard. Yeah, I mean, that's true. Yeah, we can change the meaning of a word by the way we say it, right? And I don't know if every language is that way, but I know English is that way for sure. All right, so let's look at the idea of profane. Let's look in Exodus chapter 20. So those are words and thoughts, things that we can say that hurt people or that are filthy or pushing the line, pushing the envelope. Those kinds of things will elicit a laugh sometimes. I guess that might be the appropriate word. They'll get people to laugh because it makes you uncomfortable, because it shouldn't be said, but it's still being said. And so sometimes people will laugh that way, and it's a cheap way to get a joke across. Have you noticed that whenever comedians who are really, really funny want to keep trying to be funny, they tend to get more and more vulgar. And that's the reason it's just easier to get a cheap laugh like that. All right, let's look in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 7. So you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. All right, so then compare that to Leviticus chapter 19. In verse 12, says, you shall not swear by my name falsely, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Okay, so in that context, what does it mean to profane? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that can apply that way. I think there's a little more to it, though. I think it, because of verse in Leviticus where he says, "Don't swear by my name falsely." Well, were they allowed to swear by the name of God in the Old Testament? They were actually told to. I should have looked at that verse. They were told to swear by my name and not by the name of other gods. You swear by my name. But he says here, don't do it falsely. So what does it mean to swear by God's name falsely? Is you're taking an oath, and you're not telling the truth. You're calling upon God as witness to what you're saying, and it's not true. That's what he says. Don't do that. Don't swear by my name falsely. Okay, so what does it mean to swear by his name? Well, it's actually calling an oath to God. You're making an oath. You're calling on the Lord as witness to this situation. So when people walk around and say, as God is my witness, what are they saying? They're taking an oath. They're calling upon God to witness. So as God is my witness, this happened in such a way. Well, it better be true, because that's taking the Lord's name in vain if it's not. casual mention of the Lord. You know, the Jews, even today, even there's some Messianic Jews who I've interacted with who won't even write the word God. They'll put G-D because they want to make sure they don't accidentally use his name in vain. And that's not even his name. But they've gone a long way with that. But that's how they've understood this. Not to mention Jehovah or Yahweh in passing out of reverence for him. Now, I don't know if that's the intention, but that's how they took it. In fact, if you see in your Bibles, your Bibles will have, when it has the Lord in all capital letters, what does that mean? It means that's Yahweh. So in Hebrew, if you look it up, it's YHWH, Yahweh. That's not Lord. That's God. That's the name of God. That's Jehovah or Yahweh. We're really not sure how to say it. Probably closer to Yahweh. But when they would come upon it in reading, they would say Adonai, or whatever it is. I think that's what it is in Hebrew. They would say the Lord instead of saying the name because they were afraid of saying it and not meaning it or taking in vain. So they had a deep respect that way. And that's why, because of these passages. So it's hard for me to dismiss that and say, well, it can't be just that. I agree with what you're saying. It's in a bigger picture. Certainly, if you're going to take on God's name, you need to make sure you're being truthful and faithful to him. But also, I think it's related to swearing, calling God to witness on something. So here's an interesting question that was brought to me one time by actually a deacon somewhere. He said, what is the name of God? I said, Yahweh. He said, is God God's name? I said, no. He said, so how can I say God and be taking the Lord's name in vain? So he just went around saying God for everything. And he would use it as, what is the word, when you stump your toe, he would just say God. Do you think that's okay? I think that's the point, is it something that's you're treating it with reverence? What does the word profane mean? Remember? We've actually been talking about it for a couple weeks, mentioning it. It's taking something that's holy and treating it how? It's common. And it's disrespectful. It's not really, you're not using the word. You can say any word you want to as an exclamation, but God's name and God is holy, and talking about spiritual things in the spiritual ways. Did you know, this kind of is not the same, but it shows you the reverence or the respect that we should have for the things that we are unaware of. We know what's on earth. We don't know what's the spiritual realm that much. Look in the book of Jude. And this is something that has really stood out to me and made me question a lot of things that I used to hear and even have said. In Jude verse 9, this is when Michael the archangel is contending with the devil when he disputed about the body of Moses. This is the only place in Scripture we see this. It's not written in the Old Testament. But he was disputed about the body of Moses, dared not bring in against him a reviling accusation, but he said, the Lord rebuke you. But these people, speaking of false teachers, speak evil of whatever they don't know. And whatever they know, they naturally, like brute beasts and these things, they corrupt themselves. What does that say about the nature of the spiritual realm? It's not something that even Michael the archangel would speak against Satan. That's pretty amazing. He called upon the Lord to rebuke him. And so the contrast here is verse 10, but these people, these false teachers, speak evil of the things that they don't understand, they don't know. So even talking bad about angels or even talking bad about Satan in a sense is something that we should be careful of because we're dealing with things we don't understand. That's the only way I can take that. And if that's the case, how much more with God? When we are dealing with God and we're using his name or calling upon him, we're mentioning him, it's not something that's frivolous. And it shouldn't be treated frivolously. So think about that. Does OMG fit that category? You know what OMG is. It's saying, oh my God. But instead of saying those words, they just say OMG. Is that the same thing? When people hear it, yeah. Yeah, I've heard people say, "OM goodness," and there's people that say, "Well, goodness is God too." I'm not going into that, but God, OMG is certainly something that is generally interpreted that way. So gotta be careful with it. Now, if you're around a friend and he knows exactly, again, we're going back to remember the preacher I mentioned before. I can use the F word, but I think it means something different. So I can use it around my other friends because they think it means something different too. Like, really? You can't use that around me? He said, no, I wouldn't use it around you. So we kind of play games, right? And it's really childish. We say, well, I'm going to say this, but I know you're going to interpret it that way. I don't know. One of the things as a teenager in the 80s, the lyrics of songs were horrific, and they were all written in such a way that gave the teens an out. So if a parent heard it and said, hey, they're talking about this, they could back up and say, no, you misunderstood. You have a dirty mind. Well, we knew what they meant. We knew what the words meant, and we knew the implications of it. But when we're called on it, we got to say, no, I didn't mean that. You have a dirty mind. You shouldn't think that way. And we can put it back on them. Has anyone ever tried that on y'all? My kids tried that on me a couple of times. Like, I know that trick. I used to do that all the time. So the words that we're around and we're saying and using, we got to be really careful. Now, you may say it and you may mean something different. Great. But how do other people hear it? That's an important thing. Look at Matthew chapter 12 and verse 5. It's another passage. And to a degree, it doesn't matter what people think of us, but to another degree, it does. Because if we're going to be a lot, we should try our best. In verse 5, it says, or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? All right, so let's talk about that for just a minute. I think it'll help us understand profanity. My footnote says desecrate. How did the priests profane the Sabbath? They worked, all right? Why did they work? Because they were told to, okay? So if they were told to do it, did God tell them to profane the Sabbath? No, absolutely not. But why then would Jesus say that was profane to do it? He said that they profane the Sabbath. Yeah. Exactly. So whenever they were told to do it, they obviously then that became an exception to the rule, or it meant in some other sense. So here's the question. Was it ever wrong to serve God on the Sabbath? That was kind of the intention of the Sabbath, was to do what? To rest. And what did they usually do on the Sabbath? That was a time of dedication to God. Now, they couldn't go out and do work, but what did Jesus do on the Sabbath that people were upset about? Healing people. Was that work? In a sense. In fact, he said, God has been working from the beginning and I'm still working. I'm going to keep working. So it's a different kind of work. What's the work that the law required them to stop doing? Their secular work, the work for a living, right? That's what that's all about. So the profanity was just a perception of profanity that they were using, and Jesus says, listen, if I'm profaning the Sabbath or my apostles are profaning the Sabbath by plucking grain off of ears of corn or grain, then what about the priests? they're even worse because they're doing a lot of work. But obviously they didn't believe the priests were doing anything wrong. So anyway, I think it's important that we understand profanity and what you can't do something right and have it be wrong unless you're doing it at the wrong time or something like that. But when we are looking at things that are holy, we don't want to treat them as if they're common. And there may be times we do that unintentionally and don't realize what we're doing. So we need to be careful. Sometimes it's the words that we say, sometimes our actions. I would say even coming here and worshiping God, but you're not really worshiping God, that's profanity too. That's profane. It's taking something that's holy and not. I mean, I've knew a man who came and he brought his children and his wife, and during the sermon they passed out books and they all read their novels during the sermon. That was, in a sense, he was diminishing what was going on there in the worship service. So it's something to think about. All right, we got a little bit more time here. Let's dig into. Can you repeat it, Andrew Gumpert? Yes, Andrew. I'll repeat the questions. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's true. That brings up a good point. And we need to be generous with people too. We don't need to be walking around policing, right? That's not the intention of what I'm talking about tonight. But it's for ourselves so we can grow and mature. But you're right. Sometimes people say stuff they don't realize it's wrong, or they may misspeak, and then you get to decide: is this something that's a habit? Do I need to talk to them about this, or do I just give them grace and say, maybe they made a mistake and didn't realize what they did? I mean, we have to make those kind of decisions, don't we? One of the things that we do. By the way, does it count if it's online? I think I know people that believe if it's on Facebook and I share it, it doesn't matter. Somebody else said it and I just shared it. But when you share something that someone else said, are you basically saying it? In a sense, yeah. You're saying, here, look. One of the things I got in trouble for and didn't realize when I first got into Facebook, I didn't realize when you share, it shares not only the image or the text, it also shares like the name of where it comes from. And sometimes those names had cuss words in it. And people would call me out and say, hey, why are you cussing? I'm like, I'm not doing anything. He's like, look at this. And, well, what do you have to do? You go change it. You go erase it because you're putting it out there or something. I've been amazed at sometimes at Christians who, it doesn't matter what they share. It can have cuss words. It can have, partial nudity. It can have all kinds of stuff that really are at least questionable, if not outright wrong. And they're thinking, well, I'm not responsible. That's their thing. I'm just sharing it. No, you are responsible. It'd be the same thing as if you would listen to a false teacher. You heard something and he said something that you thought, well, I can at least like that part, and you share that with everyone else. That's pretty dangerous. It's something we need to be really careful about. Okay, so what's the last thing I wanted to talk about was a word that we call euphemisms. And what is a euphemism? It's a replacement word. And it usually, the word "you" in there means good. So it's intended to be a better word than something else. So you take one word and you replace it with something else that's more palatable for us to understand. And I'm not going to suggest that all euphemisms are wrong, because a euphemism can be anything. I mean, if I wanted to use a different word for this podium, I can use a euphemism for the podium. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. But it is possible that euphemisms can be wrong if we think about it. Now, this is more of for your personal reflection, right? I don't believe that I can walk around saying, hey, I can't believe you said that. I think we have to look at ourselves. But when we do think about this, let's say that I'm talking to you, having a conversation about Hitler, and instead of using the word Hitler, I use Fluffy Bunny. All right, so I'm talking about Hitler. I'm talking about World War II when Fluffy Bunny was killing all these Jews. Now, if I'm talking about Fluffy Bunny, who am I talking about? Am I talking about a Fluffy Bunny? I'm talking about Hitler. That's a euphemism. Now, why would I want to be careful and not talk about Hitler? I don't know. Somebody may be sensitive to it. But what if I'm using a cuss word and I replace it with another word and I say, well, I'm going to use this word instead of that word, but every time I use this word, I'm going to mean that word. Is that appropriate? That doesn't make much sense because the meaning is still there. It may be softened, but the meaning is still attached to it. So we have to be really careful. We had a rule when we were walking around Russia, we had a rule. If you see or hear something in Russian, never repeat it until you know what it means. Because why? Well, you may be saying all kinds of stuff that's wrong. You need to be really careful. And I know that can sound really picky, but whenever we use words, we need to be careful of what we may be replacing that word with. So there are a lot of words that people use that they don't realize what they're saying. I know people that would never go around saying, oh my God, but they say, oh my gosh. Do you know what gosh means? It means God. Look it up in the dictionary. It's what it means. There are a lot of other words that are even more harsh, we consider more harsh, that we kind of replace them with softer words. And I don't mean that if you stump your toe and you say ouch, I'm not saying you're doing something wrong. I'm saying be careful in the things that you say because it may come across differently than you expect it to. And usually people that use euphemisms, they want to be able to cuss, but in a milder way. I don't think that's appropriate. It seems to be like I want to take 50% of wrong and do it instead of the whole thing. Does that make sense? So last thing is, what is a curse? So we talk about cuss words. Cuss means curse. What is a curse? Almost fell over. Is that the first bell? A curse is when you speak evil on someone. You call evil down on them. And it can be a word or it can be a sentiment. Those all relate to the things that we've said before, especially going back to Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 4 with the coarse jesting and things like that. All right, any other comments? Yeah, I could see that. So that's a great way to break a habit, like you said, is if you're used to saying one word, you cuss like a sailor, you said, then you can use a word that has no meaning. And I would try to not associate it, and no one should be able to associate it to it. But yeah, so that's one of those things. We have to just be careful, I think, of how we're using words and what we're trying to say. And that, I don't think we have to worry about it. That's right. What comes out of here is really important, and out of here, right? The things we do. Yeah. All right. Well, very good. Thank you very much.